Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the murky, surprising world of why medieval folks drank beer instead of water a choice. That wasn't just about taste but survival. Picture yourself trudging through a muddy 13th century village, your boots squelching in the damp earth. The air smells of wood smoke, livestock, and something sour drifting from a nearby well. You're parched, but the water in that well looks like it's plotting your demise cloudy, with a suspicious sheen. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive a sip without a stomach rebellion. In the Middle Ages, water was often a gamble, and beer was the safer bet. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your city and the local time. I'm curious where you're drifting off from tonight. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing by the village well, a stone-ringed hole that's the heart of this community's water supply. A woman hauls up a bucket, and you wince at the murky liquid sloshing inside, flecked with bits of who knows what. Mainstream history tells us that by the 1200s, wells in medieval Europe were often contaminated by nearby cesspits, animal waste, and runoff from streets, making water a breeding ground for diseases like dysentery. You're not keen to test it, especially after hearing a villager cough nearby. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some folks tossed garlic cloves into wells, believing it purified the water. You spot a shriveled clove floating in the bucket, doing nothing but adding a weird aftertaste. Historians still argue whether this was superstition or a faint grasp of herbal properties. Would you drink garlic-flavored sludge? You step back, noticing the well's proximity to a privy you'd rather forget, its stench wafting over like an unwelcome guest. A quick joke. Why was the well so unpopular? It was the village's worst bartender. You're not laughing, though, as a kid runs by, splashing muddy water from a puddle that's probably cousins with the well's contents. Everyone here knows the risks: fevers, cramps, or worse after a drink. You see a man chugging from a clay mug of ale instead, his face relaxed, and you get why. Beer, boiled during brewing, was cleaner than this well's grim offering. You turn toward a nearby tavern, its sign creaking in the breeze, promising a safer sip. The well's a death trap, and you're already craving the malty tang of ale over this questionable water. You're sitting at a rough-hewn table in a dimly lit medieval peasant's home, the air thick with the scent of fresh baked bread and a faint whiff of manure from the yard outside. Your host, a weathered farmer, slides a clay mug of frothy ale across to you, and you're expected to drink it with breakfast. Yes, breakfast. It's not coffee or orange juice. It's beer, the medieval go-to for starting the day. The ale's weak, barely alcoholic, with a yeasty tang that's oddly comforting. Compared to the village well's murky horror you dodged earlier, you take a cautious sip, feeling the gritty texture of unfiltered brew. Mainstream history tells us that by the 13th century, beer, often called small ale, was a staple in European diets, consumed daily by peasants, monks, and even kids. Because it was safer than water, brewing killed off germs, making it a lifeline in a world of tainted wells. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some peasants added leftover bread crusts to their ale, believing it boosted the flavor and strengthened the spirit. You notice crumbs floating in your mug and wonder if it's breakfast or just lazy brewing. Historians still argue whether this was about taste or stretching meager resources. Would you sip bread-soaked beer? You glance at your host, who's dunking barley bread into his own mug, unfazed. A quick joke. Why was medieval breakfast so hoppy? because ale was the morning's MVP. You're not laughing, though, as you swallow another gritty gulp, grateful it's not the well's garlic-tinged sludge. The room's crowded with the farmer's family, his wife stirring a pot, kids scrambling for scraps, all sipping ale from shared mugs. You recall the well's suspicious sheen. No wonder they're all drinking this instead. There's no water on the table, just a jug of ale, refilled from a barrel in the corner. It's not just safer, it's a ritual woven into daily life like prayer or plowing. Another joke. What's a peasant's morning motto? Rise, sip, survive. The ale's mild buzz is barely noticeable, but it's calorie-rich, fueling these folks for a day in the fields. You finish your mug, feeling oddly fortified, and step outside, where the well's stink reminds you why beer's the hero here. This breakfast ale's no death trap, it's a lifeline, keeping you one sip ahead of the village's tainted water. You're standing in a smoky, low-ceilinged brew house in the heart of a medieval village. The air heavy with the sweet, malty scent of boiling barley and the faint tang of yeast. You're watching a brewer, a burly woman with flour-dusted hands, stir a massive cauldron over a crackling fire. Steam rises, and she tosses in a handful of herbs. Her movements practiced but weary. This is where the ale you drank at breakfast comes from, the magic that makes beer safer than the village well's murky death trap. You're here to see how brewing turns risky water into something you can trust. Mainstream history tells us that by the 13th century, brewing was a vital craft across Europe, especially in England and Germany, where boiling water and fermenting grains killed off bacteria, making ale a safer daily drink than raw water sources. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some brewers swore by chanting rhymes over their vats, believing it blessed the ale with strength. You catch the brewer muttering a rhythmic verse, and you're not sure if it's for the beer or her own sanity. Historians still argue whether these chants were superstition or a way to time the boiling process. Would you sing to your brew? You step closer, dodging a splash of hot wort, and feel the heat from the fire. A quick joke. Why was the brewer's cauldron so happy? It got to boil away the bad stuff. You're not laughing, though, as you notice the water she's using drawn from the same well you avoided turning clear as it bubbles. The brew house is a hive of activity. Apprentices haul sacks of barley, and a cat prowls for rats. Eyeing the grain, you recall the gritty ale from breakfast, probably made here, crumbs and all. The boiling kills whatever nasties the well carried. But the process isn't foolproof. Spilled wort on the floor attracts flies, and the barrels look like they've seen better days. Another joke. What's a brewer's worst fear? A barrel with a grudge. The brewer skims foam from the cauldron, explaining how fermentation purifies the mix. Though she doesn't know about germs, you're grateful for the science she doesn't understand, especially after dodging the garlic-clogged well. As you leave the brew house, the malty warmth lingers, a reminder that this ale, rough as it is keeping you alive in a world where water's the real death trap. You're weaving through the crowded streets of a medieval town, the air thick with the smells of fresh bread, horse dung, and the ever-present tang of open sewers. You're parched, but the public fountain you pass a stone basin with a sluggish trickle looks like it's brewing trouble instead of relief. The water's cloudy, flecked with bits of grime, and you spot a kid dunking a muddy stick in it for fun. After seeing the village well's garlic-tinged sludge and sipping the brewer's gritty ale, you're starting to understand why nobody trusts water here. You head toward a tavern instead, hoping for a safer mug of ale. Mainstream history tells us that by the 14th century, urban water sources in towns like London or Paris were often polluted by nearby privies. tanneries, and butchers, making them hotspots for diseases like cholera and typhoid. Beer was the go-to because it was boiled clean. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some townsfolk believed water from certain fountains was cursed by water spirits if it looked murky. You overhear a vendor muttering about spirits as he avoids the fountain, clutching his ale jug instead. Historians still argue whether this was pure superstition or a folk way of recognizing bad water. Would you blame a spirit for that slime? You steer clear, remembering the brewhouse's boiling vats that made ale safe. A quick joke. Why was the town fountain so lonely? Nobody wanted its spirited drinks. You're not laughing, though, as you sidestep a puddle that's probably cousins with the fountain's contents. The tavern's just ahead, its sign swinging in the breeze. But you pause to watch a water seller hawking buckets from a cart. His water looks no better than the fountain's, and you wonder who's desperate enough to buy it. The memory of the breakfast ale's yeasty tang feels like a warm hug now. Another joke. What's a medieval water seller's pitch? By my brew, it's only half diseased. The crowd around you prefers their mugs, and you get it. Every sip of water's a gamble, especially with cesspits leaking nearby. You push into the tavern, where the air's thick with malt and chatter, and order an ale, grateful for its boiled safety. The fountain's a death trap, and you're sticking with beer to stay alive in this filthy urban maze. You're stepping into the cool, stone-walled cloister of a medieval monastery, the air heavy with incense and the faint hum of monks chanting in the distance. You're here to uncover the secrets of their brewing, a sacred craft that's keeping you safer than the town's murky fountain or the village's garlic-tinged well. You follow a robed monk to a brewery tucked behind the dormitory, where barrels line the walls and the scent of fermenting barley mixes with damp earth. A cauldron simmers over a low fire, and a monk stirs it with a wooden paddle, his face serene despite the sweaty work. You're offered a small cup of their ale, cloudy, slightly sour, but cleaner than any water you've seen. Mainstream history tells us that by the 12th century, monasteries across Europe, especially in Belgium and Germany, were brewing ale as a staple, using their clean springs and strict processes to create drinks safer than local rivers or wells. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some monks believed their ale was blessed by saints, making it a holy alternative to water. You notice a small shrine in the brewery corner, with a candle flickering for Saint Arnold, patron of brewers. Historians still argue whether this was spiritual devotion or a clever marketing ploy. For their brews, would you toast to a saint? For safety, you sip the ale. It's tang-sharp but reassuring, and think of the town's cursed fountain. A quick joke. Why was monastery ale so divine? It had a saint seal of approval. You're not laughing, though, as you watch the monk skim foam, his precision a stark contrast to the village brewer's haphazard chants. The brewery's orderly, with neat rows of barrels and a stone channel carrying spring water cleaner than anything in town. You recall the gritty breakfast ale and the urban fountain's grime. This monastic brew feels like a gift. The monks drink it daily, even during fasts, calling it liquid bread for its calories. Another joke. What's a monk's favorite prayer? Bless this brew, skip the dew. You finish your cup, feeling the faint warmth of the ale, and thank the monk, who nods silently. As you leave the brewery, the incense lingers, but so does the relief of drinking something that won't kill you. This monastery ale's no death trap, it's a sacred shield against the era's tainted waters. You're seated at a grand oak table in a medieval lord's dining hall, surrounded by flickering torchlight and the clink of silver goblets. Servants bustle, carrying platters of roasted boar and bread, but your eyes are on the jug of ale being poured into your cup. It's a pale, cloudy brew, weaker than the monastery's ale, but far safer than the town's grim fountain you dodged earlier. The nobles around you sip casually, their velvet sleeves brushing the table, as if drinking. Beer at every meal is the most natural thing. You take a sip, tasting a faint maltiness, and realize this is the lifeblood of even the elite. Mainstream history tells us that by the 14th century, nobles across Europe drank ale or watered-down wine daily, as water from castle wells was often contaminated by nearby moats or cesspits, making beer the safer choice for feasts and daily life. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some lords insisted their ale be served in pewter mugs engraved with famil Y crests, believing it added noble vigor to the drink. Your cup has a boar etched on it, but it's not making the ale taste any fancier. Historians still argue whether this was about status or just aristocratic whimsy. Would you engrave your mug for clout? You sip again, grateful it's not the garlic-tinged well water from the village. A quick joke. Why did the lord love his ale? It was his coat of arms in a cup. You're not laughing, though, as you notice a servant refill the jug from a barrel that looks suspiciously dusty. The hall's lively, with laughter and a minstrel strumming nearby. But you can't help thinking of the brewhouse's boiling vats and the monastery's Saint Blessed barrels. Even here, among wealth, water's a risk. Castles weren't immune to bad wells. Another joke. What's a noble's worst banquet guest? A glass of water with bad intentions. The ale's mild, designed for sipping all day, and you're starting to see why it's on every table. From peasants to lords, a noble woman across from you raises her mug, toasting the host, and you join in, feeling the ale's faint warmth. As you set the cup down, you're thankful for its boiled safety, a shield against the hidden dangers lurking in every untrustworthy water source. You're standing in the dusty yard of a medieval village, watching a gaggle of children chase a stray chicken, their laughter mixing with the cluck of livestock and the faint stench of a nearby privy. You're not here to play, you're noticing the clay mugs in their hands, filled with the same cloudy ale you drank at the Lord's feast. These kids, barely old enough to tie their own shoes, are sipping beer like it's juice, and nobody bats an eye. The idea feels wild, but in this world, it's safer than the well water you dodged with its garlic-clogged menace. You hand a mug to a freckled boy who grins, wiping his mouth with a grubby sleeve. Mainstream history tells us that by the 13th century, children in medieval Europe drank small ale, low-alcohol beer daily, as water from wells and streams was often contaminated, posing a greater risk to young, vulnerable bodies. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some parents believed ale gave kids strength for chores, mixing in honey to make it palatable. You watch a girl sip her sweetened ale, her nose wrinkling at the taste, and wonder if she's dreaming of something tastier. Historians still argue whether this was about nutrition or just a lack of options. Would you give a kid beer for breakfast? You offer a sip from your own mug, and the boy takes it eagerly, unfazed by the gritty texture. A quick joke. Why did medieval kids love ale? It was their superhero juice, minus the cape. You're not laughing, though, as you glance at the well, its surface shimmering with dubious specks. The kids keep playing, their mugs sloshing, and you recall the monastery's Saint Blessed brew and the noble's fancy goblets. Even here, among muddy feet and straw roofs, ale's the trusted choice. There's no water jug in sight, just a barrel by the house, refilled daily. Another joke. What's a medieval kid's bedtime story? The tale of the evil water witch. You pat the boy's head, handing back his mug, and he scampers off, ale in hand. It's strange to see, but you get it. Water's a death trap. And this week, Malty brew is keeping these kids alive, fueling their games and shielding them from the diseases lurking in every unboiled drop. You're weaving through a medieval town's narrow streets, the air thick with the stench of open ditches and the chatter of vendors hawking their wares. You're parched, but the memory of the cloudy village well and the town's grim fountain keeps you from reaching for water. Instead, you're drawn to the whispers and wary glances of townsfolk who talk about water like it's a cursed potion. You overhear a baker muttering about a neighbor who fell ill after drinking from a stream, blaming bad humors in the water. It's not just gossip, water's got a terrible reputation here, and you're starting to see why everyone, from kids to nobles, sticks to ale. Mainstream history tells us that by the 14th century, water was widely distrusted in Europe due to frequent outbreaks of waterborne diseases, like dysentery, pushing people to rely on boiled, fermented drinks like beer for safety. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some townsfolk believe drinking water at night invited moon sickness, a vague ailment tied to lunar phases. You catch a woman eyeing the darkening sky, clutching her ale mug like a talisman against the moon's wrath. Historians still argue whether this was pure superstition or a way to explain water's real dangers. Would you skip a sip under a full moon? You sidestep a puddle that smells suspiciously like the privy you passed, feeling grateful for the kid's gritty ale from earlier. A quick joke. Why was water so spooky? It had a reputation for moonlight mischief. You're not laughing, though, as you notice the baker avoid a water cart like it's carrying plague. The town's buzzing, but nobody's drinking water. You see a man pour a bucket from the fountain into his garden, not his cup. And you get it, water's for plants, not people. The memory of the monastery's clean brew and the Lord's pewter mugs makes you crave ale's safety. Another joke. What's water's medieval nickname? The silent assassin in a bucket. You head toward a tavern, its warm glow promising a safer drink. The stories of sickness linger, each one a reminder of why beer's the hero here. Water's not just untrustworthy, it's a death trap. And you're happy to stick with the malty brew that's kept you alive so far. You're pushing through the creaky door of a medieval ale house, the air thick with the warm, yeasty scent of fresh ale, and the hum of laughter from a dozen townsfolk, crowded around scarred wooden tables. You're not just here for a drink, you're joining a social hub where ale's not only safer than the town's cursed fountain but also the glue that binds this community. You grab a stool, and a barmaid slides a clay mug your way, its frothy contents sloshing slightly. The ale's weak, like the kid's breakfast brew, but it's a far cry from the moon sickness water you've been dodging. Everyone's drinking, from the blacksmith wiping soot off his hands to a merchant boasting about his latest deal. Mainstream history tells us that by the 14th century, alehouses in towns like York or Bruges were central to social life, where people gathered to drink safe, boiled ale, share news, and escape the risks of contaminated wells and streams. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some alehouses had ale stakes, long poles outside that signaled fresh brews, but locals swore the best ones were blessed by passing friars. You spot a weathered pole out front, and you wonder if a friar's touch made this ale taste better. Historians still argue whether these blessings were about faith or just good branding. Would you trust a friar's ale over a regular brew? You sip, feeling the familiar gritty texture, and think of the monastery's saintly barrels. A quick joke. Why was the alehouse so popular? It served safety with a side of gossip. You're not laughing, though, as you overhear a tale about a man who drank stream water and hasn't been seen since. The room's alive with chatter, deals being struck, jokes flying, and a fiddler in the corner adding to the din. You recall The noble's polished feast and the village kids' muddy mugs. Ale unites them all. There's no water here, just barrels of small ale, refilled constantly. Another joke. What's an alehouse's secret weapon? Beer that beats the well's bad vibes. You clink mugs with a grinning tanner, feeling the camaraderie, and realize this place is more than a refuge from water's dangers. It's where life happens. As you finish your ale, the barmaid refills it without asking, and you're grateful for this malty shield against the death trap of unboiled water lurking outside. You're in a bustling medieval village, the air thick with the scent of damp straw and the faint tang of yeast from a nearby brew house. You're not sipping ale with the townsfolk this time. You're meeting an alewife, a skilled woman whose brewing keeps this community alive. You step into her small workshop, a cluttered space with barrels stacked high and a cauldron bubbling over a fire. She's kneading malted barley, her hands dusted with grain, and offers you a mug of her latest brew, cloudy, sharp, and far safer than the moon sickness water you've been avoiding. Her ale's the backbone of the village, served at the alehouse and the peasants' breakfast table you visited. Mainstream history tells us that by the 13th century, women like alewives dominated brewing in England and parts of Europe, crafting small ale that was a safer daily drink than contaminated wells or streams, especially for families. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some alewives marked their barrels with a chalk X to signal a strong batch, believing it warded off sour spirits. You spot a chalked X on a barrel and wonder if it's magic or just marketing. Historians still argue whether these marks were practical or tied to folk beliefs. Would you trust an X for a better brew? You sip her ale. Its bite softer than the monasteries, and nod in approval. A quick joke. Why was the alewife's brew so good? She stirred in a pinch of wizardry. You're not laughing, though, as you notice the water she's boiling, probably from that grim village well, transformed by her craft into something safe. Her workshop's a hive of activity. Apprentices haul grain, and a cat chases a stray mouse. You recall the alehouse's lively chatter and the noble's pewter mugs. This alewife's brew ties them all together. She explains how she ferments just enough to kill germs but keep the ale mild for daily drinking. Another joke. What's an alewife's secret? She brews trust in every barrel. You watch her pour wort into a barrel, her movements precise, and realize she's not just a brewer, she's a lifeline, shielding the village from water's death traps. You finish your mug, grateful for her skill, and step back into the village, where her ale flows like a river, keeping everyone one sip ahead of danger. You're sitting on a creaky bench in a medieval village, the air thick with the smell of freshly turned earth and the faint yeasty tang from the alewife's brew house nearby. You're sipping her cloudy ale, grateful it's not the cursed water from the town's fountain or the village well's garlic-tinged sludge. But today, you're pondering more than safety. Ale's not just a shield against disease. It's practically food in this world. Your mug feels heavy, the brew thick with grains, and you realize it's fueling you as much as the bread on the table. Mainstream history tells us that by the 14th century, small ale was a nutritional staple across Europe, especially for peasants, providing calories, hydration, and even some vitamins in a diet scarce on variety. With water often tainted by cesspits or livestock, beer was a lifesaver in more ways than one. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some villagers called ale liquid bread, believing it could sustain them through lean harvests. You swirl your mug, noticing its hearty texture, and wonder if you could skip dinner altogether. Historians still argue whether ale's calories were a deliberate dietary choice, or just a happy accident. Would you trade a meal for a mug? You Take another sip, feeling its subtle warmth, and think of the alewife's chalked barrels and the monastery's blessed brews. A quick joke. Why was ale a medieval superfood? It fed your belly and dodged the well's wrath. You're not laughing, though, as you recall the town fountain's murky sheen. A reminder of water's risks. The village around you hums with life, farmers hauling grain, kids sipping ale from shared mugs, all relying on this brew for energy. You notice a woman chewing barley bread, washing it down with the same ale, and it hits you. This drink's as essential as the harvest. Another joke. What's a peasant's grocery list? Ale, bread, and a prayer for clean water. The ale's mild buzz is barely there, but its calories keep you alert. Unlike the water that could knock you flat with fever, you set your mug down, feeling oddly full, and glance at the well across the yard. Its surface still suspicious. Ale's not just a drink here, it's a nutrient-packed shield against the death trap of unboiled water. You're trudging along a muddy path just outside a medieval town, the air heavy with the damp scent of earth and a sharp, unpleasant whiff from a nearby stream. You're parched, but the water flowing beside you is a sickly green, flecked with debris that looks suspiciously like it came from the town's privies. After dodging the village well's garlic-tinged mess and the town fountain's cursed reputation, you're not about to risk a sip here. The stream's a grim reminder of why everyone from alewives to nobles sticks to beer. You clutch your mug of ale, its familiar malty tang a comfort, and steer clear of the water's edge. Mainstream history tells us that by the 14th century, rivers and streams in Europe were often polluted by urban runoff, human waste, and industrial muck from tanneries or mills, making them as dangerous as wells for drinking and driving people to rely on boiled ale. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some townsfolk believed river water could be cleansed by tossing in a silver coin, hoping it would banish bad spirits. You spot a glint in the stream, probably someone's lost penny, doing nothing to clear the murk. Historians still argue whether this was superstition or a misunderstanding of water's dangers. Would you toss a coin for a clean sip? You take a swig of ale, thinking of the alewife's hearty brew and its life-saving boil. A quick joke. Why was the river so unpopular? It served filth with a side of slime. You're not laughing, though, as you pass a privy perched too close to the stream, its contents likely seeping right in. The path is busy with travelers and farmers, all carrying jugs of ale instead of water skins. You recall the monastery's clean springs and the nobles' pewter mugs. Even they avoided rivers like this. A fisherman nearby pulls up a net, muttering about the stream's foul taste, and you're glad you're not eating his catch. Another joke. What's a medieval stream's promise? A sip you'll regret for weeks. You keep walking, sipping your ale, its gritty texture a small price to pay for safety. The stream gurgles beside you, a flowing death trap that reinforces why beer's the hero in this world of tainted waters. You're caught in the swirl of a medieval town festival, the air buzzing with the laughter of jugglers, the strum of lutes, and the clatter of wooden carts. The scent of roasted chestnuts mixes with the sharp tang of spilled ale, and you're parched from dodging dancers and hawkers in the crowded square. You'd kill for a drink, but the memory of the polluted stream and the town's cursed fountain keeps water far from your mind. Instead, you join a throng around a makeshift ale stall, where barrels are tapped and mugs overflow with frothy, weak ale, the same kind you sipped at the alewife's workshop. Everyone's drinking, from merchants to peasants, their faces flushed with festival cheer and the safety of boiled brew. Mainstream history tells us that by the 14th century, festivals in towns like Bruges or Norwich relied heavily on ale. as organizers knew water from local sources could sicken crowds, making beer the go-to for hydration and merriment. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some festivals held ale races, where drinkers competed to chug mugs for prizes, believing it honored the harvest gods. You watch a burly man down a mug in seconds, ale dripping down his beard, and wonder if the gods are impressed. Historians still argue whether these contests were about fun or a way to flaunt brewing skills. Would you race for a free mug? You grab an ale. Its familiar grit a comfort after the river's green sludge. A quick joke. Why was festival ale so popular? It partied harder than the water did. You're not laughing, though, as you dodge a sloshed reveler who nearly spills his mug on you. The stall's a chaotic hub, with barmaids pouring fast and coins clinking. You recall the monastery's Saint Blessed brew and the noble's pewter goblets. Here, it's rough clay mugs, but the ale's just as vital. A nearby fountain gurgles, ignored by the crowd. No one's touching the death trap. Another joke. What's a festival's worst drink? Water that crashes the party. You sip, feeling the ale's mild warmth, and join a toast to the harvest. Your mug raised with the crowd. The festival's joy is infectious, but it's the ale safe, boiled, and flowing that keeps this celebration alive, shielding everyone from the water's lurking dangers. You're trudging along a dusty medieval road, the sun beating down, and the air thick with the scent of dry grass and distant wood smoke. You're miles from the festival's lively ale stalls, with no village or tavern in sight, and your throats, parched from hours of travel, your water skins empty, and the memory of the polluted stream and the town's cursed fountain makes you wary of any roadside brook. You clutch a small jug of ale, pilfered from the alewife's workshop. Its contents, warm but safer than any water you might find. Travelers pass by, merchants with creaking carts, pilgrims muttering prayers, all sipping from ale jugs or wineskins, not water. Mainstream history tells us that by the 13th century, travelers in Europe relied on ale or wine for hydration, as roadside streams and wells were often contaminated by human waste or animal runoff, making them risky for drinking. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some travelers carried ale stones, small pebbles they believed kept their brews fresh on long journeys. You feel a smooth stone in your pocket, a gift from a fellow traveler, and wonder if it's doing anything for your jug's stale contents. Historians still argue whether these stones were superstition or a placebo for weary travelers would. You carry a rock for fresher ale. You take a sip, wincing at the warm, gritty taste. But it's better than the stream you passed. Its surface slick with green. A quick joke. Why was travel ale so trusty? It didn't betray you like a brook did. You're not laughing, though, as you spot a muddy trickle nearby, buzzing with flies and reeking of trouble. The road's a gauntlet of dust and ruts, and you envy the festival's overflowing mugs and the monastery's clean barrels. A passing pilgrim offers you a sip from his jug, but you stick to your own, wary of shared germs. Another joke. What's a traveler's worst thirst? One quenched by a stream's bad ideas. You keep walking, the jug lighter with each sip, and pass an inn with a dubious well out front. Nobody's drinking from it. The ale's your lifeline, a boiled shield against the death trap of roadside water, keeping you going until the next tavern or town. You're shivering in a medieval village square, the air biting with winter's chill and the ground crusted with frost that crunches under your boots. Your breath clouds in front of you, and you're desperate for a drink, but the village well already suspect with its witchy curses is now a frozen death trap. Its bucket stuck in a block of ice, and its surface a dull, cloudy sheen. The tavern's too far, and your jug of ale brewed by the alewife whose ribbons you admired at the market, is nearly empty. Its contents cold, but still safer than any water here. You huddle near a fire where villagers are warming their hands, their own mugs of ale steaming faintly, and you realize winter's made the water problem even worse. Nobody's cracking the well's ice, not when tales of frozen fevers haunt every sip. Mainstream history tells us that by the 14th century, winter in Europe worsened water woes, as frozen wells and streams halted flow, trapping filth and germs, making ale boiled and stored the only reliable drink for villages cut off by snow. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some villagers believed tossing hot coals into a well could wake its water, thawing it without a curse. You see a man eyeing the well, a coal glowing in his hand, but he hesitates, clearly doubting the old trick. Historians still argue whether this was practical desperation or just another water myth. Would you chuck a coal for a sip? You sip your ale, its gritty warmth a lifeline against the cold, and think of the alehouse's rowdy brawls over brews. A quick joke. Why was the winter well so mean? It froze your thirst and hexed your hopes. You're not laughing, though, as the wind howls, and you pull your cloak tighter, grateful for the ale's faint heat. The square's quiet, with only a few villagers braving the cold, their mugs clutched like treasures. You recall the market's lively alewives and the siege's ration jugs, even in winter. Ale's the hero. A woman offers you a sip from her mug, but you stick to your own. Wary of sharing in this germy season, the well's ice glints under torchlight, a reminder of water's betrayal, frozen or not. It's a risk nobody takes. Another joke. What's a frozen well's promise? A sip as warm as a witch's glare. You take another sip, the ale's calories, staving off the chill, and shuffle closer to the fire. Winter's turned water into a solid trap, but ale, brewed and safe, keeps you one step ahead of its icy, cursed dangers. You're weaving through a raucous medieval alehouse, the air thick with the warm, yeasty scent of spilled ale, and the sharp tang of sweat from a crowd packed shoulder to shoulder. The flickering glow of tallow candles casts shadows on scarred wooden tables, where townsfolk are shouting, laughing, and right now brawling over whose brew reigns supreme. You duck as a clay mug sails past, narrowly missing your head, and grab a stool near the barmaid, who's pouring frothy ale from a barrel marked with a familiar ribbon from the market's alewife. After dodging the village well's witchy whispers, you're here to witness the chaos of alehouse rivalries, where loyalty to a brewer can spark a fistfight faster than a bad hex. Your own mug, filled with gritty, safe ale, is a lifeline in this rowdy scene. Mainstream history tells us that by the 14th century, alehouses in towns like York or Ghent were hot spots for social clashes, with patrons fiercely defending their favorite local brews, boiled and safer than any water as a matter of pride and survival. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some alehouse brawlers wore ale tokens, small charms carved with their brewer's mark, believing they brought luck in fights. You notice a man with a wooden pendant, now swinging wildly as he argues about his alewife's superior batch, and wonder if it's helping his odds. Historians still argue whether these tokens were about loyalty or just tavern bravado. Would you wear one to back your brew? You sip your ale, its malty bite a comfort amidst the chaos, and think of the well's eerie curses. A quick joke. Why was the alehouse so rowdy? The mugs threw punches before the men did. You're not laughing, though, as a table flips nearby, and you scoot closer to the barmaid for safety. The crowd's a mix of blacksmiths, weavers, and a merchant trying to stay above the fray, all clutching mugs of their chosen ale. You recall the market's ribbon-marked barrels, and the siege's ration jugs. Here, Ale's not just safe, it's a badge of honor. A rival group chants for a different brewer, their mugs raised like battle flags, and you're glad you're just a bystander. There's no water in sight, nobody's risking the town's cursed streams or wells in this den of boiled brews. Another joke. What's an alehouse brawl's prize? Bragging rights and a bruised mug. You grip your ale, dodging another wayward elbow, and realize these fights, chaotic as they are, show how deeply ale mattered. It's no death trap like water, just a fiercely loved lifeline that sparks passion, pride, and the occasional tavern tussle. You're trudging along a winding path beside a medieval pilgrimage route, the air filled with the scent of pine and the faint dust kicked up by your boots. The sun's high, and your throat's parched from hours of walking. But the roadside stream you pass is a no-go. Its water's murky, swirling with leaves and a suspicious oily sheen that screams privy runoff. You clutch your small jug of ale, a gift from the alewife whose ribbons caught your eye at the market. Its contents warm but safer than any stream or frozen well you've dodged. You're not alone. Pilgrims shuffle past, their cloaks dusty, chanting prayers and sipping from their own ale jugs, swapping stories of shrines and safe brews. After surviving winter's icy wells and the alehouse's rowdy brawls, you're here to share ale with these travelers, all bound by the need for a drink that won't curse or kill. Mainstream history tells us that by the 14th century, pilgrims across Europe, from Canterbury to Compostela, relied on ale or wine for hydration, as roadside water sources were often tainted by human waste or livestock, making boiled brews a holy necessity. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some pilgrims carried saints' vials, tiny flasks of ale blessed at shrines, believing they held miraculous powers. You notice a woman with a vial tied to her belt, her face serene as she sips, and wonder if it's just ale with extra faith. Historians still argue whether these vials were spiritual or just savvy souvenirs. Would you sip a saint's brew for luck? You take a swig from your jug, its gritty maltiness a comfort against the stream's foul glint, and think of the village well's witchy whispers. A quick joke. Why was pilgrim ale so sacred? It saved your soul and your stomach. You're not laughing, though, as a pilgrim coughs nearby, and you keep your jug close, wary of shared germs. The path hums with travelers, monks, merchants, a limping old man, all trading sips and tales. You recall the siege's rationed ale and the market's lively stalls. Even here, ale's the trusted choice. A young pilgrim offers you a sip from his flask, but you decline, sticking to your own brew, boiled and safe. The stream gurgles, tempting, but treacherous, ignored by all. Another joke. What's a pilgrim's worst sin? Trusting a stream's sweet lies. You share a nod with the woman, her vial glinting, and keep walking, the ale's faint warmth fueling your steps. This stream's a death trap, but ale, shared among pilgrims, is a lifeline, keeping you safe on this dusty road to salvation. You're leaning against a weathered fence at the edge of a medieval village, the fading sunlight casting long shadows over muddy paths and thatched roofs. The air carries the familiar tang of yeast from the alewife's brew house, and your mug of her cloudy ale feels like an old friend after dodging tainted wells, cursed fountains, and roadside streams. You're reflecting on why beer was more than a drink here. It was survival, woven into every corner of life, from kids' breakfasts to festival toasts. The village hums quietly now, with farmers hauling grain and a kid sipping ale nearby, just like you saw days ago. Mainstream history tells us that by the 14th century, ale was a cornerstone of medieval Europe's diet and culture. Its boiled safety shielding people from waterborne diseases that plagued towns. and countryside alike, saving countless lives. In an era of filthy water, here's the quirky tidbit. Some villages held ale feasts to honor brewers, believing their craft kept death at bay. You imagine the alewife raising a mug at such a feast, her chalked barrels the real heroes. Historians still argue whether these feasts were gratitude or just an excuse to drink. Would you toast your brewer? You sip your ale. Its gritty warmth, a far cry from the stream's green sludge. A quick joke. Why was ale the medieval MVP? It outshined water's deadly schemes. You're not laughing, though, as you recall the monastery's saintly brews, the noble's pewter mugs, and the traveler's warm jug, all lifelines in a world of death-trap water. The village settles into dusk, and you think of the alehouses, chatter, the festival's overflowing barrels, and the kids' muddy mugs. Ale wasn't just safer, it was community, nutrition, even ritual. Another joke. What's ale's medieval legacy? It kept you toasting, not tossing. You finish your mug. The last drop's a reminder of how this brew carried people through a perilous world. You set it down, grateful for the boiled safety that kept you one step ahead of water's dangers, and turn from the fence, ready to leave this malty tale behind. The village fades now, its bustle softening into a gentle hush as the stars emerge overhead. You're no longer clutching a gritty mug or dodging a suspicious stream. Picture a quiet meadow, the air clean, carrying only the scent of dew on grass. The worries of wells and rivers drift away, like leaves on a calm breeze, leaving just the soft rhythm of your breath. Those medieval ales, with their yeasty tang and life-saving boil, are just stories now, fading into the night's embrace. You're safe, wrapped in the stillness, where the only sound is a distant cricket song. Let the weight of those death-trap waters slip off, the tales of brewers and barrels dissolving into a peaceful haze. Your eyelids grow heavy, the world softens, and you're sinking into a gentle tide of sleep. No more risks, just calm, pulling you to a quiet place. Drift now, and let it all go. Sweet dreams.